Thank you, and good morning. Thank you, Program Director, and the panel. Now, I want to be quite brief so that we have some engagements, discussions. And the first thing I want to do is to draw the parallel, and appreciating the history of the student movement that you took us through. And the parallels I want to draw is the type of society that necessitated the revolt, the student and youth revolt in 1976, and the type of society that we have today, and whether the objective conditions that obtained at the time necessitate that sort of revolt. And I think, there were different cultures at the particular period compared to now. There were different influences. There were different forms of mobilization, tools that were available to the student movement at the time. And if you listen to some of the testimonies, one of the students who was involved, well, not even one of the students, but one of the student leaders who was involved, talks about how it took them 3 days to essentially get to mobilize students to go and converge at Orlando Stadium and be involved in a rolling, endless mass action until the apartheid government steps down. Now, 3 days. So, but if you think about what happened with some of the protests that happened on campus, most of them were spontaneous with the various tools, notice boards on Twitter, Facebook, and all of that. But I think what is important for me is the kind of cultures that were involved as part of the parallels that I think we need to draw. The speaker from the June 16 Foundation who spoke at the launch of government's Youth Month program on the 1st of June says something that I thought was very pertinent. The fact that Morris Isaacson High School is still there, the structure is still there, students are still going and attending in that school, on the one hand, whilst on the other hand, there seem to be orchestrated acts of sabotage of inanimate, I call them inanimate objects, which is, in the case of UJ, the auditorium, the Minister of Higher Education says it cost broadly UJ, I think about 100 million rand, and if we put together all the other campuses, we're talking just above R1 billion that would be required to fix this property. And obviously that's resources that could have been directed into something else. So that's part of the cultures of responsibility in action, and the myth that if we listen, or rather if we destroy public property that is intended to intensify the very same struggles that the youth of and student of 76 intended to ensure that we have access to. So we're essentially defeating the essence of our struggle. And I think for me that's a very important parallel that we need to draw between the two. What was very similar, and I think we really, as the current generation of youth and the student movement, was that both 76 and the protests that we've seen on campuses got to mobilize communities. So it wasn't only about UJ students or VET students or TUT students, but it got to mobilize communities broadly. So we saw, workers also joining into the action, but not only that, but also saying, look, these are our issues, these are our demands. So it moved beyond the common issues that confronts students across the board, and also became issues about workers, and in many instances where universities responded to students' issues. The struggle still continued because the leadership of students said it was not only about students, but it was also about the workers' struggle. But what I found quite important with the actions of December last year was that more than any other time, I mean, we have in what I would refer to as historically black universities or institutions of higher learning, we have protest on a yearly basis on similar issues. And in many instances, those go on unnoticed. They become the issues of that particular campus. Forte, University of the North Limpopo, TUT in particular is one that's always on the news. But I think, so there was this huge difference between what would ordinarily be common struggles of predominantly working class or students from working class backgrounds, and students who go to now historically white universities, UJ, Wits, UCT, and all of those, and how all of that, middle and upper class students' struggles began to occupy and I think for me that was quite interesting. And the fact that many of the student leadership, the SRCs, and I'm sure they'll talk more about it, South and the president of the SRC, the fact that they were saying we do not want politicians as part of these actions. We do not want politicians to take advantage of these campaigns because you would want to muddy the water and use them for your own electoral or whatever other purposes. Now, as to why that was the case and why it continues to be the case, interesting as it is, I think it's one of the things that we need to dissect. The students of 76 made it very clear. In fact, the notion of black power gained popularity post 1976. My parents spoke to me in 86 and also and beyond about the fact that it's referred to as Youth Day and all of that, or Psycho Day, or whatever you want to call it. But when it erupted in Soweto and caught fire all over the country, it became what is known as Black Power. And its association with the National Liberation Movement was unashamed. So I think that parallels are quite important. I want to conclude, because we're going to have that long discussions, with spending a few minutes on what I believe are things that I think we need to be preoccupied with, which have got to do with the complexities of post-colonial nations and in our case, post-apartheid nation, and some of the challenges that in 1993, 94, 95, we were confronted with the constitution adopted in 1996. One of the biggest challenges was that because apartheid was in every fiber of society, it dictated who you're getting married to, it dictated what time you leave town, it dictated which school you go to or which university, it dictated which job you're going to be employed at or whether you're going to be unemployed or not. So that was the nature of the apartheid system. And what the Constitution sought to affirm was the notion of people's power, and that people through different forms of organization would rule themselves. So you have, in the case of student leadership, a student representative council, you have a school governing body, you have a university council, you have in communities, over and above local government councillors, you've got ward committees, you have all this, you've got trade unions which are legitimate, legal, and can protest and all of that. And the intention was to have all of these as organs for people power, organs for self-rule, to get people through democratic processes, determine the space that they are occupying and how that space is going to, and that social to somewhat also organize that interaction between different social forces, in society. Now, one of the biggest mistake with that, and this is my own theory, is that we assumed that by empowering communities to take decisions, communities had that social capital, that human capital equally. So we assumed that South Africa was a homogeneous country where everyone had that social human capital to be able to organize themselves and make interventions on their own in order to ensure that we build a non-racist, non-sexist, democratic society. But what essentially happened was that in many instances, it further disintegrated communities with certain communities using that platform of organs people for people's power to further isolate themselves into islands of prosperity. I mean, if you go into Johannesburg, there are so many small states, if I may call it that way, where people organize their own boundaries. It's a gated community. They organize their own security. They organize their own schools, healthcare centers, facilities, and all of that. Now, it's precisely because they have the social, economic, and human capital to be able to do that. Now, a school in Pimville is dependent on government intervention, as opposed to the people who are the school governing bodies, who ordinarily at St. John's, some CEO or billionaire at Anglo-American would make whatever interventions that are required, if it's a sports field or this or that, whereas the rest of the population are dependent mainly on the state to intervene. Now, the intention of, and it manifests itself in various forms in society. You can think about access to education. You can think about how the workplace is organized, and that those who essentially own a factory, if I'm to take that minute example. So I'll decide who I employ. I'll decide what their role is in the factory. I'll decide how much I pay, irrespective of what government legislates. And those who are working there would be dependent on that organ called the trade union to be able to interpret and enforce all of these rules, and all of that. And that's the type of unequal power that 1976 was all about. That, for instance, we are seeing an integrated classroom in 2016. Yes, there are integrated classrooms, but are they to the extent within which they were visualized? We're seeing an integrated university, but it is precisely because certain people can afford and others cannot. And that's why the insistence on the state to be able to use education as an equalizer to facilitate access and all of that. And protests would predominantly be to government instead of where the actual resources are being hoarded and not being used in order to ensure that what we envisioned in 1976 and subsequently 1996, wherein people's organs are essentially empowered in order to facilitate the type of self-rule. And I think that it's it's one of the reasons why many African countries 10, 20, 30 years post colonization, and in our case post-apartheid, begin to question the legitimacy of democratically elected governments precisely because of how certain issues that had to do with colonization or segregation or and so forth were not settled. And I think we're beginning to see remnants of that. So the youth of 2016 are beginning to say, yes, there is political power. Yes, we have representation in all of these spheres of government, but that's not enough if we're really to go back to the basics. Building a nation that is united, that, in all other respects, be it language, be it culture, be it whatever that you want to put as variable that can and will constitute a South African nation, you have to deal with issues that are, I think, greatly equalizers. And some of the key things are not economic freedom or equal economic participation or economic inclusion or whatever you want to call it as a philosophical, high up engagement. But if you're saying people's power, people's organs, you've got to ensure that peoples have access to that social capital, in order to ensure that they exercise that power. And I think that's the big challenge that we, are having. I can easily churn out numbers and statistics and all of that to show what government has done over the years, but I think that you probably have easy access to all of that information. And what I think is critical for this discussion is not only those parallels, but what makes us even or what should make us even more interested in the current struggles if we're really to realize the vision of the youth of 76. Thank you very much.